It all began with a sound no one could ignore, a child's broken cry echoing down a dirt road. His tiny hands trembled as he held the shattered remains of a plastic truck, tears mixing with the dust on his cheeks. "They broke my toy," he sobbed, his voice cracking with the raw ache of betrayal. "And they hit my mom." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. The boy's words lingered in the air like a storm about to break. And the moment he said them, every biker in the garage froze. Grease-stained hands stopped mid-turn, wrenches clattered to the floor, and the growl of engines quieted into an ominous hush. The leader, a broad man with a leather vest marked Iron Hearts, lifted his gaze toward the trembling child, his jaw clenched, the muscles in his face tightening with something far beyond anger. "Who did this, kid?" he asked, voice low and steady. The boy pointed a shaking finger toward the far-off factory on the edge of town. That was all it took. The story of what happened that day would be told for years in that small, forgotten town, not because of revenge, but because of the strange, burning thing that lives inside people when they decide they've had enough of cruelty. The boy's name was Sammy. He lived with his mother, Rita, in a weather-beaten house that stood just beyond the old railway tracks. Life hadn't been kind to them. Rita worked long hours at the textile factory, the same factory that loomed like a shadow over the town, with its broken windows and its tall, coughing chimneys. The pay was little, but it was all they had. Sammy spent most of his time waiting for her return, his only companions being his toys, hand-me-downs and cheap market finds, and his wild imagination that could turn cracked pavement into racetracks and old boxes into castles. That morning, Sammy had taken his favorite toy, a small red truck with one missing wheel, to the alley near the factory gates. He liked watching it roll down the slope, pretending it was delivering cargo to faraway lands. But his innocent play caught the attention of three men in factory uniforms. They were rough, loud, and mean, the kind of men who laughed at other people's pain. One of them snatched the toy from Sammy's hand. When the boy begged for it back, they mocked him, smashing it under their boot until it cracked in two. Rita, hearing her son's cries, ran out from the gate, wiping sweat from her forehead with trembling hands. "Police," she pleaded, her voice trembling, "who's just a child." But the men didn't like being told what to do. One of them shoved her so hard she fell to the ground, her lips splitting open against the gravel. Sammy screamed. And that was the moment, that raw, desperate scream, when a mechanic named Rihan, who happened to be passing on his bike, turned his head. Rihan wasn't the kind of man who ignored cries for help. He was the heart of the Iron Hearts, a group of bikers known more for their loud engines and broken pasts than for heroics. But underneath the tattoos and scars, there was still fire, still humanity. He lifted the crying boy into his arms and saw Ruta trying to stand, blood at the corner of her mouth. His eyes darkened. "Who did this?" he asked quietly. When the boy pointed, the world seemed to narrow down to a single target, the factory. That evening, the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in a bruised red. The Iron Hearts gathered outside their garage, a circle of men who had all once been broken by life in one way or another. Some were former soldiers, others ex-workers from that same factory who'd been thrown out when they demanded fair pay. They weren't saints, but they had a code. You don't hurt women, and you don't break a kid's heart. Sammy sat beside Rita on a wooden bench, watching the men prepare. "You don't need to do this," Rita whispered to Rihan, her voice raw with both fear and gratitude. "It'll only bring more trouble." Rihan shook his head slowly. "Trouble's already here, ma'am. It just picked on the wrong family." Engines roared to life. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder announcing war. The people of the town peeked through windows, watching as a line of motorcycles, black, chrome, and burning with fury, tore down the road toward the factory. Sammy's wide eyes followed them, his broken toy clutched to his chest. For the first time since that morning, his tears stopped. There was something about the sight, something fierce, something just that told him everything would change. The factory loomed ahead, its gate guarded by the same men who had hurt Rita and mocked her boy. But when the bikers arrived, it wasn't chaos that came with them. It was silence. Rihan dismounted first, his boots crunching on gravel as he stepped forward. The men at the gate sneered, but the sneer faltered when they saw the dozen riders behind him, faces grim and eyes unblinking. "You like picking on kids?" Rihan asked. No one answered. How about you try picking on someone who can fight back? One of the guards reached for a metal rod, but before he could swing, Rihan's hand caught his wrist mid-air. The sound of the rod clattering to the ground was like the end of arrogance itself. No one dared move after that. The factory supervisor came out, his voice loud but trembling. "This is private property! You can't just barge in." Rihan stepped closer, his tone calm but slicing like a blade. "You're right. But when your men hit a woman and scare a child, that stops being private. That becomes everyone's business." The crowd of workers that had gathered began whispering. They had seen the cruelty for years, the beatings, the unpaid wages, the threats, but no one had ever stood up to the management. Until now, Rita, still bruised and unbroken, arrived moments later holding Sammy's hand. The boy looked up at the bikers like they were knights in armor. The supervisor, seeing the crowd turn, tried to back away, but Rihan's words pinned him where he stood. "You're going to pay her medical bills, replace what was broken, and make sure this never happens again. Or we'll make sure this factory never opens its gates again." There was no fight after that, only surrender. To by nightfall, the air was calm again. The bikers stood outside the factory as Rita thanked them, her eyes glistening. Sammy, shyly holding the glued-together pieces of his toy, approached Rihan. "You fixed my truck," he whispered. Rihan crouched down, resting a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Nah, kid," he said softly. "You fixed us." The engines rumbled once more, fading into the night as the Iron Hearts rode away, their silhouettes swallowed by moonlight and dust. Weeks later, the factory started treating its workers better. Not out of kindness, but out of fear of what happens when people finally stop being afraid. And every time the sound of motorcycles echoed in the distance, Sammy would run to the window, smiling. He'd learned something that day. That courage doesn't always come from power, but from standing up when no one else will. And though the world had broken his toy, it couldn't break his spirit. Because somewhere out there, the Iron Hearts were still riding, and justice was still alive on two roaring wheels. Would you like me to expand this story further into a screenplay-style version suitable for a 100-minute YouTube film with dialogue, scene transitions, and pacing beats? That would make it flow perfectly for cinematic storytelling.